Hello, everyone. So welcome to our Systems Seminar. The series is created by Ava Labs for developers, engineers, product builders, and anyone interested in learning about latest research and advancements in blockchain. And very happy today that we are joined by Justine, the head of governance at Optimism, who have met at the IC3 Winter Retreat. She will talk about governance design today. So very excited for this. Thanks, Justine, for joining us today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm going to give the presentation I gave at IC3. Since this presentation, we've actually hired a research and experiments lead to help us answer many of these questions. She's great. She has a PhD in political science, which is a very useful perspective when you're trying to design governance systems, obviously. So I'm the head of governance at Optimism. I was the first person to join the foundation there. The main distinction of Optimism's governance system relative to most others is that we are doing two things. One, we're taking an iterative approach and running experiments, probably not in a scientific term, but we're doing many tests and then evolving them kind of as we go. And the main difference is that we are establishing a bicameral system. Okay, so 2 houses, or basically in this case, 2 DAOs. I think I kind of covered this, but the foundation's role is to steward the development of this system. So we're taking a progressive decentralization approach. In our working constitution, we've outlined a timeline for that of 4 years, and we're about 2 years into that timeline. It's probably plus or minus on that, but the idea is the foundation plays like the bootstrapping role to set up and establish the system and then phase ourselves out of that until we're just one of many contributors doing this. The main decisions our governance system makes are around technical and economic parameters of the protocol and ecosystem. We're able to run governance, what we call seasons. It's basically just like a time-bound period to try things or to experiment. And they happen on a cadence of every 6 months, more or less. And so that's interesting to people that work in some of the more traditional disciplines, because it's much faster than you can run a political experiment in a real life political situation or with a government, obviously. But as we go about establishing this system, there's some pretty big design challenges related to voting design, system resilience, how to prevent gridlock, how to identify collusion, and these questions need to be answered by research across disciplines, as poli-science, game theory, privacy, cryptography, when you talk about public or private voting, etc. So this presentation will give a general overview of how the governance system is set up, and then what some of those open design or research questions are. Kind of as it relates to the design of the system. So the main difference with Optimism governance is we have 2 houses. Why do we have 2 houses? The main reason is to prevent capture, basically. So it creates a system of checks and balances. Most DAOs use token-weighted voting only, and unpopular statement, most DAOs are captured, meaning they are controlled by one or a few people that own a majority of voting power or tokens. So having a dual house system can help us avoid some of the pitfalls of a purely token voting based system. Kind of the secondary idea behind this design is that by having different voting mechanisms in each house, you can match kind of the decision-making type to the incentive model. So the token house makes decisions about ecosystem growth and more of the economic parameters of the system, and that's token weighted, and the citizens house makes decisions that are meant to not be primarily economically driven. So in this system, there are different proposal types that are the primary responsibility of one house or the other. So it can be the exclusive responsibility. One can basically be driven by let's say the token house and the citizens house can have veto rights over it and vice versa. And in very few circumstances, there are governance responsibilities that would be shared kind of equally between both houses. The other reason for having this two-house system is that it's kind of designed to create this self-sustaining flywheel. So as I mentioned before, the token house drives ecosystem growth. It makes prospective grants, and decisions about the economic parameters of the system with the goal to drive activity on the network. That should generate sequencer profits, which the citizens house can then choose how to allocate. And they will likely allocate that towards retro PGF, which is kind of the primary responsibility of the citizens house. You've probably heard of retro PGF. It's a retroactive public goods funding. Optimism is not the only protocol or project that allocates grants that way, but we have dedicated 850 million OP to our retro PGF. Actually, I think this presentation is out of date and we call it retro funding now. Anyways, need to update it. But we have 850 million OP reserved for this. And it's to support contributions that have aided in the development and the adoption of Optimism, which then drives economic growth, which then goes back to the token house. So the token house, I'm like throwing these terms around and you might not know what I'm referring to. The token house is the same as you would think of as any other DAO. Basically, you have anybody who holds the OP token can vote, or they can delegate their votes to someone else to vote on their behalf. And this is your standard one token, one vote model. It's plutocratic, and that's okay because it's designed with that in mind, basically. And so the token house represents the free market in the collective's decision making, and they make decisions that affect economic parameters of the system, like what the inflation is set to or sequencer selection. The token house has been around for like around 2 years. Some of the research questions that we have to think about in a token house is like how to measure, quote, decentralization or the distribution of voting power in the token house. We're probably going to create like an RFP to get like multiple researchers to propose different ways to measure this. It's difficult. Like ways people do it now are the Nakamoto coefficient, or the Gini coefficient, or Vibe is another one that was proposed by a group of researchers. It's hard to measure this for many reasons. So it's something that we're looking into, how to measure that and then see how different parameters either increase or decrease it. Related, but a little bit different, is like how to identify voting blocks. So maybe you have just the voting power distributed over like 100 addresses, but if the correlation between all those addresses or between groups of those addresses is very high and they essentially vote as one voter, then again, it's not really just decentralized. It's not that you have 100 different opinions, it's that you have 2, for example. Yeah, and then like lower level things like how do we design council elections or structures basically within the DAO to avoid the entrenchment of power, basically. Basically the second DAO that we have is the Citizens House, and this just launched actually in January. This is a one member, one vote model, and their primary responsibility is allocating retroactive grants, basically. And the citizens represent the human stakeholders of the collective. There's like 145 citizens right now, around that number, it's not exact, versus like tens of thousands of delegates and voters in the token house. They have to date been selected based on reputation. Basically, like there was the initial set of people that did this first experiment, which was suggested by Vitalik. And then those people for the second round were able to extend a badge, what we call the right to vote in the Citizens House, a badge to one person, and it's kind of expanded and using this web of trust model to date. The idea is over time, we build up like a graph of attestations, and then the citizens themselves will vote on what the set of attestations required to be considered a citizen is. The Citizens House is meant to make decisions that require prioritizing long-term growth over shorter-term optimizations, or basically focusing on the sustainability of the system. The Citizens House is super interesting and kind of like the main focus right now because it's harder to understand what capture looks like. Plutocratic capture is like obvious at this point. There's many examples and we know pretty much exactly what it looks like. In the Citizens House, it looks more like bribery and collusion and what happens when you have private voting. We have to deal with issues like what's the right quorum number when you have human voters as opposed to token voters and you have no pre-existing data on that. Yeah, so then you can start looking into different things like dynamic quorums. What's the right like veto threshold, for example? All these types of questions come up. Right, so these two houses act as one governance system. This is a chart that shows basically like the different governance responsibilities, which house has like primarily in charge of those, and then who has where there are veto rights, basically. This brings up like a lot of challenging questions. Primarily, how do we design a system like this that doesn't result in gridlock and stagnation? How do we set, effective veto thresholds? Do we need to incorporate reversion points? For example, like if the token house is putting forward a protocol upgrade and the citizens house just vetoes it like 5 times in a row, we need to have some kind of like default where action occurs and we don't just stay in this infinite loop, basically. How do the houses move forward? Yeah, exactly. If they have a disagreement, do we need to use like deliberative processes to facilitate like forward movement in that scenario? What are all the ways in which a bicameral system can fail? And what alternatives do we have if the system does fail? What like the higher level goals of this whole system, which is like obviously quite complex and non-trivial to build, are like there's 2 primary goals of the governance system. One is capture resistance. So it's important to ensure that no single party or actor can unilaterally control, censor, halt, or extract rent from Optimism. I would say this is like the primary motivator of the entire design of the system. That's why we have the whole bicameral structure to begin with. So yeah, there's a lot of questions here around like I said earlier, what capture looks like in the citizens house. There's different incentives in both houses, right? In the token house, you have like quote skin in the game because you own tokens that yeah, I won't talk about the tokens that much, but because you own tokens. And then in the citizens house, you don't have that model. So like the question is, what do you have at stake? And it's primarily your reputation. So you have to design different incentive models considering that. Some of the things that we think about are questions around collusion resistance, like how do we set different parameters, for example, the number of citizens with an understanding of how that impacts the probability of collusion. If you have public versus private voting, how does that impact the development of a bribery market? How do you design with the understanding that there will be a bribery market? Dark DAOs is also a concept of like kind of like vote buying, but like operating in private or in ways that are harder to identify. And how do you understand if that's occurring in your DAO, and how do you protect against it? Yeah, and then things like how do we understand the full set of trade-offs between private and public voting? Most DAO voting is public, and it's like one of the primary differences in a DAO structure versus any other structure is kind of like the level of transparency. Retro PGF voting has been private to date, and that was like primarily to allow badge holders or voters to express their true preferences and not have to worry about things like voter intimidation, et cetera. It doesn't mean that that DAO voting should always be public or retro PGF voting should always be private, right? There's should be a framework there to think about when public and private voting makes sense and what the trade-offs are in terms of the impact on collusion, bribery, herding, other things like that change with each. Yeah, and then we've looked into like, I think now we actually have like a working ZK proof that proves like that the foundation calculated the results correctly and that we're not like behind the scenes manipulating the results. And I think we have a team also working on implementing MASI, which is like, I always forget, minimum anti-collusion infrastructure. There we go. And then the second main goal is effective resource allocation, right? Like DAOs are basically a protocol in the treasury. So capture resistance, super important for the protocol. Then we have to allocate the treasury effectively. Yeah, and DAOs allow theoretically you to do that also in a more credibly neutral way than if like a private institution was deciding like which projects got grants. In this case, it's a group of citizens that do it. It's more credibly neutral. This is important to any DAO's sustainability. I think DAO's historically been pretty bad at allocating treasuries. And we're working on it, I would say. So research questions that come up in this category is like, yeah, how to align incentives, how to build a system where contributions are fairly rewarded. So like the underlying axiom of optimism or retro funding is like this impact equals profit. The whole thing is like highly reliant on being able to kind of like scope, quantify, and then assess impact as a concept. That's obviously super challenging. If you read the original article by Vitalik on retro funding, the Citizens House is essentially what he's referring to as the results oracle. And so for any of this to work, the results oracle has to be accurate. Yeah, we look at the trade-offs among different voting mechanisms for the round. So to date, badge holders have been voting on individual projects. Okay, project XYZ should get this much OP, project ABC should get this much OP. We're going to experiment now if they just vote, it's basically factor portfolio management, but let's say they just vote on the impact metrics that they think should be rewarded. And then we can like distribute rewards based on a project's ability to satisfy those metrics or meet those metrics, basically. Application filtering and curation is a challenge everywhere. Basically, we get like many applications, and so how do you filter those for like Sybil and spam, and then also just like quality, so that you have like a reasonable set of applications you're asking people to actually evaluate. Yeah, governance minimization on this last point is one of the principles in our constitution or of our like approach to design. And so we want to ask the DAO to vote on basically as few things as possible. And so one way you can do that is to have this concept of smart default. So instead of like every year asking the DAO, what do you think inflation should be set to? You can instead have this like smart default system where there's like a formula that says inflation should be XYZ for 2025 based on the following factors. And then you can allow voters to override that if for some reason they think we need to deviate from it. But it kind of reduces like the governance overhead. So yeah, that's like the high level overview of the design and some of the challenges that we face in trying to implement it. We have like over 2 years left to get the full system up and running. I would say like right now we're actually at like 30 or 35% of the way there. So there's still tons of work to do. Yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Awesome. Amazing. Yeah, so very interesting. Love to learn more about the governance. So anyone in the audience has any questions? Oh yeah, Megan.
Yeah, hi, great presentation. So I had a question about the retroactive grants program because I was looking at the guidelines you guys laid out on GitHub, and I like, how easy is it for a member of maybe not any of the collectives or any of the formal parties that you described earlier to suggest contribution that they would like to see? And then I have a second.
Yeah, just to make sure I understood, the question is like how easy is it for somebody to apply if they have a contribution they think is within scope?
No, more like I think that the ability for people to raise like potential work at like or ideas for potential work was limited to certain collective of people.
Got it.
But then I just wonder, like, if someone makes a contribution that doesn't necessarily align with any of those RFPs, then how does that affect their ability to get reviewed?
Got it. Okay, yeah. So we have it. Yeah, we have a GitHub with like different ways to contribute in it. And so one is that you can get like a grant from the foundation to fulfill an RFP. That's like a pretty well scoped out piece of work. Or the same thing, like the delegates also have RFPs and they'll give you a grant from the portion of the treasury that they manage. We also have something called, I don't know, the name has changed a few times, but like the builders ideas list or the ideas list or something like that. And that is like exactly what it sounds like, more like ideas that are not like super scoped out, and you won't get like an upfront grant for building that, but if you build it, we think it like is a contribution that should be rewarded via retro funding. It's definitely not constrained to that. It's just like a good place for builders to go that are like, I don't know, retro funding's cool, I want to build something that's valuable to the collective, but I don't really know what to build. That's like a good place to start. Right now, the people who can post ideas to that board are the course, and then something we have called the developer advisory board. In the future, like that's probably becomes like more open for anybody to put ideas on there. The main thing in terms of if you want to understand if you'll be eligible for retro funding is to make sure whatever you're building falls within a scope of the round. And so this year, like a week or two ago, we outlined like what those rounds will be for 2024. So we have one coming up for on-chain builders. And I think there's like more information on like exactly how we're defining that in the post. There'll be another round for OP Stack contributions. Yeah, perfect. Another one for governance contributions, and then a final one for developer tooling. That's not to say that those are the only things that will ever reward. Scope of the rounds is something that the DAO will have to set in the future. The foundation does it right now, but in 2025, we'll start transitioning that to the DAO, and the DAO can set the scope in whatever way they want.
What was the motivation behind this defining like round for specific areas where you'd like to see contributions? Like, why not just have open contributions for any part of OP's stack and just what was the motivation behind that actually?
Yeah, there's a few. So this was like one of probably the most common pieces of feedback we got from badge holders in round 3 is just having like one general round with kind of like a very broadly defined scope was super overwhelming just in terms of applications, and then trying to compare like a application for I don't know, like 4844 against like someone doing like a delegate onboarding program, right? So it made it like super difficult basically to assess impact. The second concern was just like in some of the earlier rounds, like there was a lot of like retro funding going towards like general Ethereum projects or like projects that weren't super tied to Optimism or having like a clear impact on driving sequencer revenue, for example. And then the concerns over that are just like the sustainability of the program. At the end of the day, it's like a limited amount of tokens, and what we're supporting does have to kind of drive value back to the collective, or we will run out of tokens.
Cool. I could think of like a million other questions. So if anybody else wants to jump in, I will let someone else speak.
Yeah, I think I was wondering with the retroactive grants, because my understanding is that you guys put up bounties, challenges, whatever it is, right, with ideas, and then people, without applying for a grant, work on a solution, and then if the solution is built, they submit it for a grant. So how do you guys do, like, I think kind of like expectation management? Like, are you very clear on that? Like, no one who applies for a retroactive grant should expect to get the grant for sure, especially like with, different quality. Maybe there's additional work to do, like all these topics. Like, I wonder how to keep a community engaged and happy to contribute with this like tricky setup. Is it like sometimes you give out a grant even though this may never be used in production, or there are two teams that build the same thing and you're like, oh, both actually solved it, so both get it? Or like, how do you do this?
Yeah, yes, this is a real thing that exists. And so some of the way, so one is just like comms around, like, if you pick up something on this board, we think it would be valuable. At the end of the day, the people posting the ideas to the board are not badge holders. Like no buddy from the foundation or OP Labs is a badge holder. So we don't actually make decisions about what gets rewarded. So we can say, we think this should be rewarded, or this is valuable in the following ways, but we don't actually have any power to allocate OP to it. We do have grants. So the Token House makes prospective grants. They're locked for a year, which is limiting in their utility, to be honest. But yeah, that's the answer, is basically like in certain situations where we think something like really needs to be built and the builder can't build it without like a certain level of a surety about receiving retro PGF, then we would use prospective grants to kind of bridge that gap. The longer term goal or vision is that retro PGF becomes frequent, consistent, and reliable enough that people can build an expectation of receiving retro PGF, and we've done enough iterations and they have kind of enough information and data to understand the types of things that are rewarded and how much they're typically rewarded, and it can become a reliable mechanism. But part of what we have to do is, and what the Gov Fund helps us do, is like bootstrap that market, right? We've done 3 rounds. We need to do many, many, many more rounds before we get there.
I see. Yeah. Aaron, I think you have a question, right?
Yeah, I'm very curious, and I feel like I can almost only ask subjective questions. But I'm very curious what you think the retro funding attracts, because it's a very different profile than for people to get funding up front. So I wonder if you sort of think of it as a reward after you've done work, and there's a separate market for people that need funding to go and build like a big project, right? Because there's VCs, there's a lot of different ways to get funding up front.
Yeah.
How do you think about like the role that it plays, what you're going after, what are you trying to incentivize, and how do you see how do you see that as the right place for Optimism to allocate its funds?
Yeah, so I think that there's like a bunch of different types of profiles of people that build for retro funding or that receive retro funding. I mean, we've definitely seen people that weren't maybe necessarily building an expectation of receiving retro funding, then they received a decent amount of retro funding, and then they kind of changed their funding models going forward, or they were like, oh, actually I'm gonna allocate 80% of my time to build stuff for Optimism now. Or one example I can think of, like they didn't need to take venture funding anymore. So sometimes like you can get the first quote round or initial interaction with retro funding, then kind of like sustains you to build stuff going forward. And so that's why I'm saying if it can happen like frequently enough, it is retroactive, but it's reliable enough where it doesn't feel that way to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess if like somebody builds a side project or something that starts out as a side project and you can reward them within a month because, I don't know, it has some number of users, then they can sort of go and continue to build that project, have a big impact, and not have to go to VCs at all, hopefully.
Yeah, that'd be in the ideal world. And like we've seen a lot like these different kind of user personas or user journeys, like on anecdotal way or like on a one-off basis. But again, like we'll get more data as we keep doing these rounds. But yeah, that's, I think, how we think about it. I mean, I think there's like a lot of people that also enter the ecosystem this way, right? Whether it's like people that are apply to work at the foundation, or people that become delegates, or people that become like community leaders. A lot of times, like their first interaction was like, oh, I got retro PDF, and then I was like, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's really cool.
But there are still teams that are like supported by grants that we make from the foundation, right? Like if for whatever reason, like they need like a stronger level of assurance, or let's say they're like, I'm not going to take VC funding, or I'm going to stop, doing this whole other set of work so I can just focus on Optimism, and then maybe we have to provide like a bridge there. But over time, that should the ratio of like prospective to retrospective should shift. The whole like basic concept behind the retro funding is basically like it's easier to evaluate what was useful than what might be useful. Right, so just doing it after the fact, it solves actually like a lot of issues that you typically run to in DAOs. The whole thing though, like, is predicated on that assessment of what was useful being very accurate, and that's where we need to do a lot of work.
Yeah, and I guess unbiased too. I can imagine that the people in the Optimism community have a very strong opinion about where the retroactive funding should go when they're building stuff for the Optimism community.
Yes and no. Like, I think like there was a lot of disagreement last round actually about like how to think about allocating round 3. So there's a lot of divergence among even just this 145 badge holders that we have. And then there's like, yeah, there's some conflict of interest rules of like you can't vote on your own project and stuff like that.
I guess that's enforced off chain.
The voting right now, or the voting in round 2, and I think I can't remember, to be honest, if 3 was on chain or not, but like it'll be on chain eventually. The conflicts of interest is harder to enforce when you have private voting, right? So like last round, the foundation like randomly sampled a subset of ballots to check for them. I think in the future, we just want to do incentive and voting design where you either eliminate the opportunity of self-dealing or reduce its impact to a point where it's negligible. So that looks like voting on the metrics that will be rewarded as opposed to the projects, for example.
Very cool.
It's like harder to it's just harder to self-deal if you're not voting directly on it on individual projects.
I know you talked a lot about how you're trying to iteratively move forward to find the best governance policy.
Yeah.
And it's all on top of the bicameral governance design, which seems like a great design to me. And, it seems a good idea. Did you guys think at all about experimenting with something that was non-bicameral?
I think I wasn't the one that made the decision for bicameral, but I'm just knowing like the principles in our constitutions and kind of like the way the founders think about things is I think the main concern was like capture, right? Like we have all these DAOs and they're captured, and then we're sitting there talking about some like minute detail, and it's like it doesn't matter anyway because 3 people control this thing. So now we have all the inefficiencies of doing things in a decentralized way for no benefit because it's controlled by 3 people, right? It's just like but we like as an industry just kind of like ignore this dynamic. So I think if I had to like guess what the problem statement would be, it would be like, how do we prevent capture in the simplest way, right? And so it's like, okay, a token weighted system is likely to get captured or to have dynamics that get close to it. And so how do you provide a check on that system? And then people have asked me like, what about a triumvirate model, or like do you need a judicial system, or like a third? And I'm like, okay, but 2 is already really complicated. I don't think we need like another one involved. So that would be kind of my guess on what the thinking was around that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Again, just subjective questions because it's an interesting history, I'm sure.
I think it's also like, also knowing the original team, it's like, let's maybe leverage some prior art and look at like other political systems and how they developed and why, and like maybe we can borrow from that. My background is mostly in finance, and I remember thinking the same thing like in the early days of DeFi of like, okay, but this is innovative, but there's also some things that we could borrow from like the traditional finance world to avoid some of these like meltdowns. I think the same thing is true with DAOs and traditional politics.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions? Nope. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Very interesting topic today. Thank you very much, Justine, for joining us. Really great to learn about how you guys are doing it. Seems like you're leading the way in this topic here. I haven't seen some sophisticated setup like this anywhere else yet. So thank you very much. And yeah, we will publish this talk on YouTube. So if you want to refer back to it, feel free to check out our Ava Labs channel there. Yeah, have a good day, everyone, and a great weekend.
Thanks so much, Justine.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.